All right. Hi, this is Hugh Herndon with the Teacher Mentor Podcast, and I am joined with Erika Watts, who is the Dean of Curriculum at SLAM Charter School in Tampa. She's also an adjunct professor at the University of South Florida and has done some content writing as well. Erika began her experience in education about 6 years ago, or rather, she taught high school English for 6 years, and in the interest of disclosure, she was my intern. Erika holds a BS in English education, a master's in reading education, and a PhD in curriculum and instruction, and a qualitative research certificate. She has published numerous articles, and her dissertation was on the negotiation of negative emotions in the ELA classroom. Erika, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So I was intrigued by your dissertation, and before we started recording, we were talking about the dissertation. So can you walk through what that dissertation was? Because the way you described it to me about how a teacher handles negative emotions in a professional capacity, um, and the example that you were giving was in a parent-teacher conference. That's something that we all have to do, because I think for a lot of students and maybe parents, there is there's a there's a perception that you can be professional, and that in that professional capacity, like, there is no emotional aspect to it. But we're a profession that has the same um, issues that any other person does, right? So we're thinking about the fight that we had with our spouse. We're thinking about the checking account. We're thinking about, all of these other just kind of normal interactions, but it's a very personal relationship with the student. And so there's this detachment that we have, but at the same time, it's also very hard to detach from that personal, because it's not like a doctor per se that can have those issues, but then they can go into a patient, and it's one patient that they may see every 3 to 4 months, and they say you need
Mhm.
to eat the food, and take the right medicine and exercise, and then they go on, but they see a little note that says, this is, Hugh Herndon, his complaint is X, Y, and Z. And so it kind of cues that doctor as to what it is. But for us, we see the same person every day for an hour a day. And so it's hard to have that wall, that defense up sometimes. So if you could just spend some time talking me through your dissertation and what you learned from about it.
Sure. So I'll start with kind of why I even wrote it. Because I think exactly what you said. You're thinking about those things like something financial happening, fight with your spouse, something like that. For me, I'd always wanted to focus on teachers in the classroom. I think a lot of our research in education is on students in the classroom. Obviously, we wouldn't have a job if they weren't students. But that being said, there's not enough focus on what's going on in the teacher's world, because we are people. There are things that happen beyond just, not a robot who comes to school, teaches the kids, goes home, makes dinner, and goes to bed. So for me, what started it was I was already kind of looking at what's going on in a teacher life. I was originally thinking about looking at more of the curriculum and the autonomy teachers have. And end of the day, I was like, that fight is something that I'm not going to be able to manage right yet, just because that's not where we're at in education.
Right.
And for me, what happened was I went on Christmas break a couple years ago, in 2020, because everything good happened in 2020. I went on Christmas break. Literally Christmas Day, my dad came into the living room and told me his dad died. So I lost my grandfather to COVID. And then within 11 days, my grandmother, who had been in the hospital for about 2 months due to a stroke, ended up coming home with COVID, hence how my grandfather got it. My grandmother passed. So within 11 days, I lost both my paternal grandparents. And I found out that I lost my paternal grandmother on a teacher planning day. I worked the whole day. I lesson planned. I told my boss. I went home 2 days later to my home state of Pennsylvania. Did the whole funeral thing, came back 3 days later and taught like nothing happened. And I was like, that's
Mm-hmm.
really awful. Um, my grandparents mean a ton to me. My grandmother's the reason I'm a teacher. So for me to just
Right.
come back and act like, nothing happened. It was good. It was had a long weekend. Sorry, friends. Like that didn't sit right with me. I didn't like that. So I started looking at how do we handle situations in the classroom that either, you might have something going on at home that kind of brings it up, or it's something that happens and it's just, how do you keep going? A lot of teachers in my study focused on the idea of like racial tendencies in text, where you teach a text where maybe the N word is used, maybe some language that we don't use anymore and we find derogatory, but at the time, like that was the word to use. Um, and students are now older and more understanding than at the time, and say like, "Whoa, you can't use that word. You're racist." No, that's that's not what happened. But then as a
Hmm.
teacher, now you have to combat. You have these kids that look up to you that need you, and now you're the bad guy. So how do you
And
show that emotion? Go ahead.
I was just saying, I didn't mean to cut you off, but also in this day and age, when if you're not careful, and depending on the school policy and the classroom and the trust that you have with the student, or the perceived lack of trust, right? Like you could wind up on YouTube, on TikTok, right? And completely taken out of context, right? And so there is also this fear of being canceled because what you're saying. And just to go back to previous, when you're talking about everything that you were going through at the loss of your grandparents, I think there is some benefit to teaching students like resiliency, like this emotional resiliency. And but how do you know when you're oversharing? Because we all have heard stories, if you've been
Yeah.
in teaching or education, where you have that teacher that overshares, and they don't need to know why you and your wife are divorcing, or it becomes too awkward, but there are some life events where it's too large to
And that's
ignore. So I think
right.
that's I think that's I think that's interesting how you hit on that thread a little bit. I just wanted to say that.
No, and it's something that I was looking at where, end of the day, where I kind of got into this, and again, don't get me wrong, I love the students. If not, I wouldn't be in a job. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing because it's not like education pays, millions of dollars. But what happens is we're going through like, SEL, social emotional learning with these students, which is absolutely they need it. I'm not saying anything against that.
Mhm.
However, we're sitting in these, again, another thing that kind of triggered my dissertation in my own life. We're sitting through these trainings as teachers talking about, if students having a bad day, let them put their head down. We'll try again tomorrow. Understood. I've done that to kids. I get it. But also, I remember I came back. So in the county I was teaching in, we had half day like professional development days. And I came back and I swear it was, just one of those moments where you're like, how did I end up here? I came back to go to the professional development day because I didn't want to miss it and, have to make it up and what else could happen. And it was a professional development they were doing on teacher wellness. And I was like, wow, like the one I've only seen in my entire
Mhm.
life, like literally one. And I will never forget the presenters made the comment, they played a video of a laughing baby. And they were like, how can you not be happy when a baby's laughing? I'm like, my grandparents just died. Like, I don't, I don't know
Mhm.
what you want me to say. Like, I mean, babies are cute, but my grandparents just died and I'm grieving that. Like, I know people don't know that going into it, but that's kind of the thing is we teach our students, like, lead with knowing you don't know what's going on in people's lives. But also we tell our students like, hey, how does this text make you feel? Especially in English. Like, how does this text
Mhm.
make you feel? But if I were to share that, there's a chance that I could lose my job, depending on the severity of the situation. And my inspiration beyond like my own personal life, my major professor is someone who works in teaching while grieving. So she talked about like teaching Macbeth after dealing with a miscarriage. It's tough.
Mhm.
It's not something that you
Yeah.
can really tell your students like, hey, Lady Macbeth might have had a miscarriage, it's inferred. I too had one. Like it just doesn't, you don't have that conversation because you get into the idea of oversharing. But at the same
Right.
time, kids don't know what Lady Macbeth is going through because in their head, like, this girl's crazy. Meanwhile, if you've ever gone through that kind of loss, you get it. So it's one of those, the main question I've always had, and I still have even after doing the research, is we have this ability to make this connection with our students in the idea of like, some kids have never grieved a death. Unfortunately, I mean, I guess fortunately for them, but unfortunately they can't relate to the text
Right.
because they haven't lost anyone yet. So how do you teach them what that character is going through if you're trying to teach like characterization, theme, whatever it might be, if you can't have that conversation? But we're so limited.
Yeah. Yeah. That's, and I think, and we both worked in the similar counties.
Mhm.
Um, but I remember, I don't think this is as big of an issue now, but CRT was like the buzzword. I don't know, maybe a year or 2 years ago or something like this, right?
Yeah.
And what I thought was so interesting was is education typically has a knee jerk reaction to anything, so it's not necessarily wrong in their concern, but it's the implementation to either protect or to advance an ideology, right? So
Right.
it's not necessarily that there was concern. Um, with CRT, it was like, but some of the topics, like for example, like in social studies, right? Like how do you share your views on government with? I mean, you can from an objective standpoint. I
Mhm.
understand that, but
Right.
what I don't think a lot of people understand is that students are going to ask, well, what do you think?
Yeah.
Or, like, well, I don't understand. They may listen to the sound bites that their parents may listen to on CNN or Fox News, right? And those are going to have completely different um, audiences, and they have their own agendas, and from an English teacher, like that's where we can go into like the rhetorical appeals, and we can try to make it just strictly curriculum, but they're going to ask you, like, who did you vote for, or
Mhm.
what do you think about this, they're going, because to them, the I don't I, depending on the class, depending on the students, like I don't think it's a gotcha mentality. It's, they want to know, and so they're trying to get information. And so when you're talking about relating to them in a relation, if they don't have that knowledge base, like if they don't have, fortunately, not fortunately, like the loss of someone in their life, it's hard for them to relate. And it's hard for them to relate if they've only been fed like one stream of
Right.
thought, one narrative.
Right. And something I found really interesting with one of my participants is kind of going back to that like CRT concept and like what you can share with the students. And based on um, Florida's laws in general, she was dealing with a situation where the library was called the Negro Library in the book. It was set in the 1950s or 60s, I believe. So, not really a word we use now, but like it made sense in the time. And that was literally the name of the library. It wasn't her calling anyone that, it was the name. And her student said, Miss, you're racist for using that word. Understood where they're coming from, 100%. And they're coming from a school of Title I poverty, lot of bad home situations.
Hmm.
And for her, she was telling me, like, she's a queer woman. She has heard every slur under the sun about herself. How do you tell your kids that? How do you say, like, look, I hear where you're coming from. I hear where you're upset about this word being used. I hear how it's, derogatory now. How do you have that conversation with your kids to say, I am the last person to act like that because I've been there, when we're in such
Right.
a political environment where she can't, depending on, I mean, she had a very supportive admin team, so I can't say anything bad about that.
Yeah, and
Um,
that helps definitely. It gives that teacher that freedom to
right.
understand, whether they can, with some classes, share more or provide more
And she had a
insight.
little bit of ability to do that, but how do you come off and say, like, she didn't want the community to come back and say, like, oh, we have this racist English teacher, when she was reading from the text, and she would be absolutely the last person to call anyone anything inappropriate, because she has a wife and kids with her wife, and she has heard everything. Like, they've
Hmm.
called her everything. Um, and it was one of those situations where it's so politically fueled, where it's like, how do you say that? How do you say, look, I'm first off, I'm not racist, and first off, like, I love you and care about you, and I would never do that to hurt you, but also I've been there. Like, I hear you.
Hmm.
And she's teaching the school she was at the time was primarily black, and she is a white woman. So she does have that kind of going against her in this conversation. But to say,
Yeah.
look, I might not be the same color as you and not deal with the racial aspect, but I'm dealing with it with my sexuality. And that
Right.
was just, it was a really interesting conversation to have. I mean, thankfully everything went really well for her. Her admin team was great. Her kids weren't going home and telling mom and dad that she was racist. Um, but it was a fear. And to live in that fear when you're trying to teach kids every single day, it's
Yeah.
impossible.
And some of that, some of those questions and comments come organically. So it's not, I mean, I know when I am teaching a text that is or has the potential to be, um, to have some racial discussions, either intentionally or just kind of a byproduct of the storyline. Like last year in my AP literature class, we read The Invisible Man by Ralph
Okay.
Ellison.
Mhm.
And I selected the text for a couple of different reasons, but it was one of the more frequently used texts. So that's also, how I came to determine which text to
Yeah.
use, right? Is to see, okay, so what does the College Board use frequently on their exams, right? So is it relevant to the exam, and then socially, culturally, it was still very relevant. But
Yeah.
so you can prepare to some degree going into certain content, certain lessons and standards going, okay, this is where I have to be careful. This is a minefield, and every class is different. Every class has a certain um, rhythm to it, and so you can go a little bit further in one class because one, you may get better discussions and better conversations and they may understand to be more capable of it than another class. And but sometimes those kind of comments and questions just come organically and then you're out there and so you individually want to go further, but in the back of your head you're going, i I don't know if this is good. So I get that, and I'm glad that you were talking about the difference with um, having administrative support or at
Mhm.
least an understanding of that.
Yeah. And that was something that it came up honestly in my dissertation defense. So as you've mentioned, like I was a classroom teacher. I've now moved into an administrative role. And one of the questions I got asked, and I really hadn't reflected on it when doing the research because honestly, it was just research that made sense to me and just how I am as a person. Someone asked me like, how does that affect your administrative duties? And I was like, I mean, I'm the person on our team that they call when they need a minute to step out of their room. Always.
Mhm.
It's always like I get a text, you got 5 minutes? Of course I do.
Yeah.
But that's just always been me. I'm always the person that's like, do you need a minute? Like, I got it. I
Hmm.
can do this. You need a minute. So I didn't really think of it as like it really affected me as an administrator, but it did. It really like thinking about this research is something that it affected the way I teach or I was teaching at the time, but it also affects the way I've become an administrator where like yes, things need to get done. Yes, I understand that we can't like we talked about my grieving situation and was I over it? No. Am I over it now 3 years later? Not really. Definitely
Hmm.
was stirred up again thinking about it when doing my defense and my dissertation and everything like that. Especially when they're like, "Can you put that in your defense?" And I'm like, "That's really personal, but sure. Let me just put that out
Hmm.
for publication." And it's something I'm comfortable talking with now, but it's tough. And I understand that life goes on. You can't just be like, well, sorry about it. I got to take a whole month off. It doesn't work like that. And we have to show
No.
kids, like you said, it's
Hmm.
the resilience. It's how it has to be. But at the same time, being able to step out for 5 minutes, it's a luxury in education. It is a luxury
Oh
to
yeah.
have someone hold your class down for 5 minutes. Even to go to the bathroom. Like end of the day, we all know you get to pee at certain times. Like,
Right.
and that's been something that I've done just because it's something I don't know any different. Like to me, that's like someone needs 5 minutes. Okay, I got it. You can do anything for 5 minutes. So if you need to go step outside and cry for a second, okay, I'll see you when you get back. I'll be here.
Yeah. And I think sometimes with education, it's so polarizing. It seems like there's so much polarization on different aspects to it. And I want to move to charter schools in a minute, but I think for the most part, students are much more forgiving and much more encouraging. I'm thinking about an incident that we had earlier in the year where a teacher got a text. Uh, their brother had been in a car accident, and it was a serious car accident, and that's in the middle of the day. Like in a normal work environment, right? If you get a text in the middle of the day that says, someone that you love was in a car accident, and not sure, what what it's going to hold, or you're and everything in those type of situations is always kind of frantic information, so you're not exactly sure if you're getting the most current information. Have they been removed from the car, or are they at the hospital, or are they in
Right.
transportation to the hospital, right?
Mhm.
But in those particular instances, like, it's not like I can just leave. Like, you have to think about, okay, so I have to pull myself and either finish the class period out. I have to message someone to cover
Yeah.
my class. I have to tell admin that I have to leave. Hopefully admin is in a position where they can respond somewhat quickly, or someone can go
Mhm.
get someone, and say, so it's not like I can just tell my boss, tell my manager, like, hey, I got to go. And they're like, all right, bye. It's,
Yeah.
it's nuanced and it's layered. But to the students, when they don't see that teacher, there is, I would say, for most classes, I mean, you might have some knuckleheads every now and then, but
Yeah.
they really are sympathetic to you. And so the barrier doesn't have to be as formal as I think what some people
Right. And that's
construe it.
I kind of what you said about like the charter school difference. I think that's something that is different, especially where I'm at now. Like I come from the public county schools where I don't know, you have like over 100 on staff, like a
Yeah.
ton. We don't have that where I'm at. So
But are you
I
fully staffed, or is that like a shortage?
no, we're only, I think, as of after break, we're I think two or three teachers short. So
Okay.
yes, we're fully staffed. Um, I think about like there's this a joke someone I know you've worked with as well made about if you're the testing coordinator at your school, which I am, you're the one who everyone has their number. Like everyone has
Yeah.
you have every number in that entire school. And so
Hmm.
as the person who one also does all the wellness in our school in that sense and the sub coverage and the testing, everyone has my number. So recently, right before break, and you know how stressful the week before break
Hmm.
is. Like there's midterm, there's every other thing happening. Every kid is going to be awful because I don't know why they're just feral that last week. They are. And that's how it is. And I had a teacher, she's a long-term sub that we have. And she just kind of bounces from room to room as needed. And we had a teacher out for surgery and she sent me a text and she said, my dad's on campus. And I was like, you and your dad don't even have a relationship, but okay, sure. I was like, do you need a like, do you need me to cover that class for a minute? And she was like, can you send, so and so up? Sure, no problem. I get a text probably about 5 minutes later that says, I found out my aunt committed suicide. I don't know what to do because I'm supposed to be covering this class. I was like, goodbye. Like, what do you mean you don't know
Right.
what you're supposed to do? Get out of here. Like, I'll figure it out. But we have that luxury because there's so few of us. So many of us wear so many hats that like if you try to get a hold of one person, you've probably hit every person you need. And that was beneficial for her. And she and I are friends in general. So for her to text me that, she was comfortable enough to tell me that. But then I have to go to like HR and be like, hey, she's not going to be back today, but like, don't worry about it. She'll tell you later because I don't want to hurt that trust. But I'm like, I got it covered. Just she's not here. Sorry. Like,
Hmm.
we have that relationship that we can have because we're so little. Where if I say, no, I got it covered. Don't worry about it. It's like, okay, it's not worried about.
Yeah.
But
Well, that is
it's
great.
hard to have a conversation with someone, especially like an administrator. If you're a sub, a teacher, and you don't have that relationship with your admin, it's hard to be like, "Hey, sorry about it, but I'm not going to be here." I think of when my grandmother died. I was actually typing an email to my principal, and in the email I said, I hadn't sent it yet. I had said like, "My grandma is in hospice. We're thinking in the next few days she's going to pass." And I was going to send it with like a, "Hey, heads up, I'm probably not going to be here coming up soon." I just typed that line and my mom called me and she was like, your grandma passed. And I like backspace and I was like, my grandma passed. Like it was I was comfortable enough to have that conversation knowing my administrator,
Right.
but I also understand that that's not always the case.
Well,
Like there's a reason people.
that's not always the case. And then also as a teacher, and this, and I think this probably goes with most individuals in the educational world, there is a sense of responsibility So even if you're out, like you're trying to put out those fires, like a few years ago, I lost my brother to suicide, and I found out at the time I was working as a testing coordinator, which was not my wheelhouse, but it's a massive undertaking in a public schools where you've
Uh-huh.
got 1,200 kids. And the day I found out, on a Wednesday night late, and the next day was I believe, like an SAT. So it was like a massive
Yeah.
testing day, right?
Yep.
And so I'm like, well, I can't call out because you're you feel like everything's on you, right? And so like, I, I mean, I would have my administrator's cell number, but I didn't really talk to them, not in that type of a way. So
Yeah.
I managed to get to work, and but then somehow on social media it started to be released, and so that
Mhm.
day was just shot for me emotionally as I'm trying to manage the test as it's being. And so they found out, and then they said you need to go home. But even still, as I'm leaving, trying to just process my brother's death, I'm still thinking about like all the things that only I really know how
Yep.
to do, and
Yep.
it's the same thing like when you're in the classroom teacher and like you have to leave, you're still thinking, okay, but I know that this student needs to make up a test, or that I had told this student to come in to see me during my planning period because
No,
they
I'm
need
not
to work
here.
on, and now I'm not going to be there, and now they don't know, or I was expecting to do this. And so it's so layered, it's so complex that I think that's one thing that I hope teachers will understand, that it's okay to have this and to process through, but eventually, the test, someone will come in there and do what they need to do for the SAT. Like College Board will get their results, that the students will have coverage, like it's okay. Like we have to deal with the person first in some instances over the profession. But
And
I
that's
wanted to
something
to trans oh, go ahead.
I would say that's something I work on as an administrator. I actually use you as an example all the time because I will never forget my first year teaching how often I try to take homework and how often you took it out of my backpack. Like
Yeah.
always. And I would be like picking something up and turn around, and it was out of my backpack. I was like, come on. And I have told my teachers that, everything's going to be there in the morning. If I need to be the person to come into your room and take it out of your backpack, I will. And they're like,
Mhm.
she means business. She will. Like, I'll do it. Because end of the day, exactly what you said, it's going to be there. No one's going to come in. I've had a principal that said, leave your stuff on your desk. No one's coming in to grade it. And you know what? The grades
Mhm.
can wait a couple of days. Your family, they can't. Your family, your
I was
friends,
just
however you are,
I was just reading an article that said the top CEOs, they were saying like they work hard during the hours that they are working, but then they leave that behind because
Mhm.
it's a mental decompression that allows them to be as effective the next day for
Yeah,
whatever it is. But it's like I work, but when it's work, it's work. But when I'm off work, I don't do
yeah.
work. So what have been the biggest, I was going to say, shocks, or what's the biggest difference you see going from public? Because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding probably from the public educator who has no experience in charter schools. So, there's always been this animosity towards charter schools. They take our funding,
Yeah,
they take our kids, and
yeah,
I don't know if I've ever really felt that, because I'm like, there's enough students that are around. Like
yeah.
you know, like I'm having classes, that are a lot larger than I would like them to be. So it's kind of like, well, if a charter school decides to take a few of them, I wouldn't necessarily
Please. Yeah.
miss that.
Right.
But there is some legitimate concern
Yeah,
over either charter schools and some of the red tape that they may not have to hold to as a public school, or funding, or different things like that. So what are some of the biggest kind of ahas that you've had from your experience in a public school going to a
yeah.
charter school that we could learn from, or vice versa?
I think something that was a big shock for me because I never had the mentality of like, oh, they're taking our kids and they're taking our funding. Because let me tell you, we're not funded. We're not funded very well. Like, we're still on the same budgets, everybody else is. We're still struggling too. Like, it's not like we just have all this money that we're just like rolling around in. We're still struggling to get things too. Funding's awful. But something I didn't realize is how a lot of charters are in the county, even if they're not like county schools. They're still supported by like mine's in Hillsborough County. I'm still supported by Hillsborough County. However, the lack of support is ridiculous. Like for example, like I mentioned, I'm our testing coordinator. I had the, I guess, misfortune of being the assistant testing coordinator as an administrator because you have to have someone on admin
Hmm.
doing it as well. And our testing coordinator quit over Christmas break last year, right before PM2 of the first year of fast testing. And it was like, well, you got it. And I was like, oh, I do. You're right. Like as if I had ever done anything with it. So then to try to find out, like, where are these things? Where's this? Where's the training on this? How do I do this? All these things that I knew in public school, they were just like, yeah, like, here's some training. Here's this, here's that. No. In charter, they're like, you got it. You're a charter school. You're with the county, but you're not. So
So you
you
don't
guys
have any
got
access to the district resources. So you can't contact Hillsborough County's like.
it. I can, but let me tell you the hoops you jump through. Like,
Oh, okay.
um, trying to get the right person because some people are like, oh, we don't do charter school. And I'm like, okay, well, like, pretend I'm public. I don't know. Like, just help me. I'm struggling. And that's not the case for everyone. I know, like, for example, with testing, they're phenomenal in Hillsborough. Like, I can't say anything about them. That was just like me learning how to do it. But for
Hmm.
example, we've had situations because charters have to go up for renewal every so many years, where we have to have certain documents, certain evidence, different things that you would think you typically have, but like you don't, in the sense that you might not have it written down somewhere. You're doing it,
Okay.
but to have the actual, like, here's this, like, we don't have it, but we don't know we need that until it's renewal time. They're like, hey, where's that one document? And we're like, and all the admin teams texting each other, do you have this document? Someone needs to get this document like right now. But
Well,
like
thankfully
we
now there's Chat GPT. So
and it's like, well, we don't have this document. Like, where is it on the page? Like, I know, for example, I struggled with there used to just be like two testing forms you signed for like the agreement as a coordinator, or not coordinator, a test administrator. And now there are four in Hillsborough County. Well, I had three, and that was like the end all be all of renewal day. And I had to find the fourth, had to get everyone to sign it and be like, here it is. Like, as if it would just always have been there. Because that's part of the game you play because you don't know what you don't know. And no one's willing to tell you what you don't know until you're like, oh, I didn't know that. And they're like, why didn't you know that? I don't
hmm
know. I'm sorry. Like, what was I thinking? And it's really tough because we have the support of our foundation, the foundation that we work with, because we're, umbrellaed under a certain academy, or not academy, but like a foundation as a whole. We're umbrellaed under people and they can help us. But, if we're in Hillsborough County with one other slam school, but the others are in, like, we have some in Miami, we have some in Boca, we have some in Nevada. Like, it's hard for us all to be like all on the same page when none of us have the same thing to do.
right. And
I'm
there's no
I'm
like a slam
no.
assessment coordinator that kind of maps out what it is for Nevada or
No,
Florida.
and
Like,
that's the thing is I can call people in Miami and I can call people in Apollo and I can call people in Boca and they're all willing to help. But at the same time, they're like, well, here's what we do over in, Apollo's in Hillsborough, but like, here's what we do down in Dade County. Like, okay, well, that doesn't help me because yes, it's the
yeah,
same test, but like also no, because each testing window is a little different per county. I can't always ask them like, well, what do you do here? Well, we do this. Well, that doesn't help me. And it's not that they're not willing to help, but it's a lot of, we have to find our resources differently than a public school where you kind of are, funneled to one area. Not that we can't funnel into the public school. I've made plenty of connections where I'm like, hey, I need this resource, please help me. And they will. But it takes a lot of, it's not just provided. I feel like in county public schools that I've been in, it's like, oh, well, the resource is obviously on the staff hub. Like, where else would it be? But then there's me in
right.
the charter. Well, what staff hub? Do I have access to that? Like, No, I'm in charter. Can I get access to that? And then I'm like emailing people like, can I please get on the science page to help my one science teacher with a curriculum question? And they're like, sure, let me add you 3 days later. And it's just, it's one of those things where you think because they're in charter, like you have everything, that it's just easy. We do our own thing, which we do. We do our own thing, but at the same time, we still have to follow county guidelines. We still use most of the curriculum the county uses. Testing in public school looks exactly like testing in charter school. It's the same, but the resources are different. So it's just kind of finding where is going to be your answer.
That's good to know because I think there's a lot of animosity towards. I say animosity. That's a pretty strong word, but when it comes to charter schools, in the sense of, um, I was just looking at an article from the Orlando Sentinel, and they were talking about charter schools and um, some of the unsavory charter schools that have um, not done well financially when it comes to
Mhm.
audits, or test performance and things like this. And then you've got some charter schools that do really well, and then it's easy to dismiss those because it's like, well, yeah, if I had the cream of the crop, I could get the I could get the grade. So I think to some degree, charter schools are in a bad position because no matter what they do, they're going to be looked at differently, and so it's like, okay, well, what can we learn in the public school from them? And what it sounds like is public or charter, like the teacher or administrator or whatever the role is, can be only as successful as the resources that are given to them.
And I think something else to kind of what you said, where like the idea of like looking at a grade or things like that. I think with public schools, they're pretty standardized. Like you got the same amount of kids almost every year. Maybe you get some more, but like realistically, what you have is what you have. Something
Hmm.
to think about with charter, for example, like our school went from our elementary school, because we're an elementary and a middle high school. Our elementary school went from an A to like a C or a D this year with testing. But something to keep in mind is when we were that A school, the only grades we had in elementary were kindergarten and fifth grade, not kindergarten through, like
Hmm.
one kindergarten, one fifth grade. So if you're testing 20 kids and 18 of them pass, boom, A. But if you're testing, 100 kids and 20 of them pass, okay, well,
Right.
now I got a whole lot more kids to deal with. Like, I got a whole slew of new problems where I'm not saying the kids are problems, but we're getting kids that are coming in all different levels because they were in public. Now they're moving to charter. Some weren't in the school, some weren't in the country. And now you want me to get them all, because it's a choice school, you want me to get them all to the same level by May? It's not going to happen. I mean, we
Right.
can
Which
we
is
can
a
try.
similar, which is a similar struggle that we have in the public school, obviously, as you know, where we have students that can just come at any point,
Yeah.
and they are expected to test
The
at a
same
level
way.
that their proficiency of language, is not there to match. But
And then you think of like growth in charter schools and things like that, because you have charter schools. I mean, last year we had um 500 kids total K through 12. We're at 800 K through 12 total. That's an additional 300 kids in a year. I mean, give or take
wow,
some numbers there, but that's a huge growth. That's, multiple more teachers. That's multiple, where we used to have maybe one teacher teaching all of seventh grade English. Now we have two. I know that's not like a huge deal. I mean, in public schools,
but
it's like three or
still,
four. But that's, now we have to worry about that. Now we have to think about how that's going to look. If you went from like last year, we had, so the year before we had just kindergarten and fifth. Last year we had one kindergarten through fifth grade, like one of each grade. Now we have two of each, except for fourth grade where we have three. So that's that's a
yeah.
huge
Well, to
difference.
to dovetail to the beginning of the conversation, as we kind of begin to wrap up the dissertation aspect, like that's another factor where I don't think individuals not in public education can really understand the the frustration at the classroom or even administrator in your role level, where if it's a corporate, if it's a business, and you can see growth and growth and growth and growth, well then as a business, you may not want to as the owner, but you're going to have to hire someone for an extra person for an extra shift because you need to have the 8 to 9 o'clock hour filled, and so you're going to have to hire someone to do that. Whereas in the classroom, that's not it. So you can have 300 additional people show up, but like in the public school system, our allocations come from the previous year, and so
Mm-hmm.
you may be having classes much larger than you want. And many years we've been trying to figure out, okay, how many chairs can we fit in here, and
Yeah.
where do we have these extra chairs? We're trying to shuffle chairs from floor to floor
Yeah.
and building to building. So it's not the same when you have this exponential growth, and that does take an impact on the teacher because we are relationally driven. And so it's like, okay, well, how can I relate to 150 students authentically, organically,
And that's
at
been
a
a big
level that's
conversation.
going to be at a level that's going to actually resonate with them, right? And so students sometimes they'll give me a little bit of static after, because I've taught freshmen through seniors throughout years. So if let's say I teach a freshman 3 years later, I may not see that student, but then they may remember me, and they'll go, "You don't remember me?" And I go, "Well, you got to give me a second." I said, "Keep in mind, I've had almost
Mm-hmm.
600 students in the time that you've had 18 teachers,
Yeah.
and that's 600 that I kept. There could be another 100 kids that I taught for a semester or a quarter, and then they dropped out
Mm-hmm.
or they moved
Yep.
classes or something like that. So, but it does take a toll on a teacher as well, just from that perspective. And that's something they have to kind of balance. And the emotions is like, what do you do
Yeah.
when the resources are not there, and it's not a result of admin per se, or even the
Right.
district at some level. It's just the nature of the beast. Like, how do you
Yeah.
constantly fight when your arms are tired and you've got
And that
weights
was
that
a
are just
conversation. Yeah, and that's a conversation I'm having with our teachers because it's something that I laugh at because again, public school, I had 150 kids a year. Like it, I knew them all. I mean, would I know them the next year? Probably not. Run into students at Target and they're like, "Oh, hey, Miss Watts." I'm like, "Hey, you!" Like whatever that is. They're like, "Oh, I remember when you taught." Like, and they're like, "Oh, when you taught at this school." I'm like, "Oh, okay, okay." Or we're getting somewhere now. You're getting
right,
closer with me. But our teachers were complaining this year, and I say this like it's funny to me. I understand where they're coming from 100%. But they were like, we're gonna have 27 in our classrooms. How are we gonna do all that? And I'm like, 27? I'm like, try 35. Try 35 and come back to
right,
me. And they were like, 35. And I'm like, please keep in mind, our graduating seniors last year, the class was like 45 kids. The whole graduating class was 45 kids. Like,
yeah,
I was like, yeah, of course you're going to know all 45 of them. It's not that hard. But,
right,
now our graduating class is 60 kids. Like we're getting crazy now. But
yeah,
it's one of the things where in charter we have that ability to know all of our kids and watch them grow up, and we're K through 12. So we get to see them. I mean, I've seen kindergartners that are now in first grade, and I've seen the fifth graders transition to the sixth grade, and getting to see that elementary to middle school transition is ridiculous because I don't know what happens to them, but something
hmm
clicks over the summer and all of a sudden they're mean. And then you have to like really humble them back and be like, remember when you do anything for a lollipop? And they're like, I do remember that. Yeah, I'm sorry. Then I'm like, all right, let's circle back to that because I don't like this. And that's something we have, but it does take a toll on the teachers when you go from teaching class sizes of 14 to having like 27. It's a big difference. I hear where they're coming from. It's just one of those things
yeah,
that if you're in the public school, you're like, okay, like it's such a joke to us that have been in there. But a lot of the teachers that we have at our charter only know charter, so they only
okay,
know this idea of 14 kids. And they're like, I have 27 today. I'm like, okay, like, what do you want me to do about it? Like, that's first off, that's the need of the school. Let's start there. But
right,
also, it's not like I put 72 in there. Like, you're watching
yeah,
27. You're okay. You're okay. I promise. But I understand, like, it's hard when you go from having, 80 kids that you have to learn in an entire year to learning 100. I know there's only 20 more kids, but that's 20 more kids. And our kids were at a Title I school. Our kids come with baggage. So we learn a lot. about these
Oh yeah.
kids. So it's not like we're just like, oh, hey, that one kid over
Yeah.
there, Johnny, doing his homework. Like, no, Johnny didn't do his homework because he had XYZ, and I have to know all that. Because if I don't know all that, then I'm not going to understand why Johnny didn't do his homework because he was working 3 jobs last night. Like, that's just, it's, it's one of those tough challenges where you don't get enough of that in public school because you don't have the ability to really get to know those kids. And that was something I was lucky enough my last year teaching to work with the senior class and, not just I taught all seniors, but not just my seniors. I was working with teachers across the hall seniors because I was friends with those teachers. So, you get to know their kids too. And I
Right.
had that ability, but it was so funny to me my first year in a charter school where I'm like, so how big's your graduating class this year? And they're like 45. And I was like, I graduated 360 last year. And they're like, how
Hmm.
many of those did you know? And I'm like, I don't know, like 340. Like I knew most of them. And that's just because I went out of my way to learn them. Did I know everything about them? No, but I knew their names. I knew the gist, like who they hung out with maybe. But that's something that's so unique about charter is we get to know these kids, but at the same time, then you put 27 in a room and it's like, I don't know, you've unleashed the beast somehow. Like it's just a panic. And I get it. I've had classes where
Yeah.
I've gone from teaching 14 kids at a time and then I've 35 the next period. And I'm just like, I don't know how I got here, but here we are. But for these teachers, it's it's almost like the world is ending. And I'm like, it's fine. You teach them the same way you taught the 14. Only the groups are a little bigger. Like that's
Yeah. And
you got
I
it.
do understand. I do understand that because I was thrown off. I have one class, and it's an AP course. It's 14 students this year, but the class that follows it is it's an underclassman, and it's, I don't know, 32, something like that. So it just doubles, and the mindset that you have to shift
Mm-hmm.
during passing, going from 14 where you can have a more relaxed classroom management approach because you've got 14 individuals. It's also APs, so there's a little bit more maturity typically in those classes. Um, so to go from 14 to 30 something, whatever, it is difficult. So I go from charter school in my first class to public school in my in the class that follows, and it is a mind shift, but
And I'm not saying we don't have the big classes in charter school. I'll never forget my first official day as an administrator. One of our teachers came down. I was over the social studies department at the time. He's now our dean of discipline, so he's in my shoes now. He's in the same role as me, just different aspect of the role. I will never forget he came down during lunch, and this is a teacher that I mean, when I say he had his life together, he was phenomenal. And he came down, and the look on his face was pure panic. And I was like, hey, like, is everything good? Like, you don't look good. And he looked at me and he goes, I have 42 kids in my fourth period. I was like, that's a lot of kids. And he was like, I'm not concerned about the 42, but some of these personalities, if you don't get them out, I will quit tomorrow. And I was like, no, like, you're joking because he's just not that teacher. Like, you could put
right.
60 kids in a classroom and he'll teach all 60. I went in and I watched for one period and I went down to my principal and I said, we need to break that class up immediately because I didn't think he couldn't handle 42 kids. I could put honestly probably 42 more in there and he'd have it. But those 42 at one time, like it's a lot of
Yeah.
stress. It depends on who's where, when, how, what happened that day, what they had for breakfast, what they didn't have for breakfast, what color shoes they're wearing. It's everything.
Hmm. And I think that is something that as teachers, there's just so many different factors that go into it beyond the content side of it, right?
Yeah.
And so beyond the curriculum, beyond the expectations that the school may have, or your departments or your administrator may have, there all of those things that are you're just trying to get through the 42 class. And I laugh because my first year when I was in education, this was before we actually had digital attendance. So we actually had
Mhm.
like the old 8.5 by 12. Like it wasn't like regular computer paper.
No.
It was something like dot matrix. I don't know, like printer,
Yep.
right? And it had enough space, I think, for like 30, maybe 32 names, but I had 2 pages for one class.
Nice.
And I was like, okay, we've got a problem here. Like, I
Yeah.
just, like, and so it, I'm like, I kept going to the administrator and being like, listen, I literally don't have enough room. I don't have enough
Mhm.
seats, you know. And they're like, oh no, it'll get balanced out. It'll get balanced out. And this was like day 4, day 5. And I'm like, they're all showing up. And so what I ended up doing was, I'm like, I had to, and this was before the door is locked automatically, but I locked the door and said, I'm just gonna I'm going to I said I'm going to write you for skipping, and if you didn't get into the classroom before the bell because the tardies were an issue at the
Yeah.
school, then you're going to, and there were probably like 15 or 20 kids, and I had no intention of writing 15 or 20 referrals,
Yeah.
but you had 15 or 20 kids that come up to an administrator at lunch and they're panicked because
Mhm.
some crazy English teacher is going to write them up, and they're like, okay, now now it's their problem, and now they begin to
Yeah.
look at it and go, okay, yeah, okay, I get it, we can't have 54 kids in this one class,
Right.
but
Right.
sometimes you have to, just to save your sanity, you have to do something just kind of just out of the realm of normal and be like, I'm going to write everyone up, and it's not the
Right.
kid's fault that they're in a class, that's overcrowded and everything
And
like
that's,
that.
I
But
mean, that's what my research is in general is like, how do, as teachers, there are so many things stacked against us on a daily, like not even just the negative emotions that come up and the situations with students that come up, because that's always going to happen. It's part of, the people job. Like you work with people, it is what it is. But how do we protect ourselves when, you got 42 in a classroom? And I don't mean like physically protect yourself, but like that's taxing. Like that is
mm-hmm,
so taxing to think about 42 kids, even honestly, depending on the kids, sometimes 15 kids in the classroom if you get the right 15.
mm-hmm,
Like it's just, how do you protect yourself? And something that I've always been focused on in my own teaching was like, I don't like taking that home. I don't like going home and feeling negative. And it's not that
right,
my job makes me negative. It's just like you have some of those days where you go home and you just want to lay on the couch and do nothing. And if anyone bothers you, so help me God. Like it's just, that's how it is. But how do you explain that to like some people in my dissertation? Like how do you explain that to your kids? You have a 2-year-old. How do you explain to your 2-year-old
mm-hmm,
that like mom's really going through it right now because something happened in a parent meeting and an admin didn't step in? Like the 2-year old's gonna be like, so do you want to play trucks or not? Like, I don't understand.
right,
Or I mean, I don't have kids, but I go home to my dog and I just want to lay on the couch. But I mean, he needs to go outside and go to the bathroom. I can't just be like, no, you got it. Like he doesn't got it. Like he needs me to do it. But there are days where I just want to come home and be like, I'm done. But
right,
how do we balance that? Because that's such a tough situation. And I
yeah,
will tell you, listening to babies laughing is not the answer. Not that I have the answers, but that's not it. So it's tough.
yeah, it is tough, but well, I think hopefully I've gotten a lot out of this conversation with you. I think that understanding, or at least presenting to individuals, one, to educators or those in the educational environment, that it's okay to have that struggle to try to find that balance with negative emotions. Like that's just part of the human experience in general. But especially if we have listeners that are not in the educational world, like to give teachers a little bit more grace when it comes to just trying to balance 30 different emotional dynamics every day, and every period, so it's a lot on us, and so that does take a toll, and that's where we have to develop the tools to kind of be able to reflect and decompress and go home and take 5 minutes on the couch, but then let the dog out, or go play with the 2-year-old, and say, okay. And that's why I took the work out of your backpack years and years ago, because I'm like, no, you're gonna have to learn to just shut it off sometimes, because that's
It's
that's
tough.
what you need.
And it's tough. And it's something that um, I think if you're not in education, this is actually like a quote from a dissertation from one of my participants. Those that aren't in education don't know what we do in education. You might be like, oh yeah, like you have a lot of kids that you work with, you have a lot of things that you work with, but you don't know. It's like those that get it kind of thing.
Right.
And that's something where, I think of scholars that have come before me, like Dr. Dutro, where she's a phenomenal person who studies like teacher emotion and also like student emotion. She lost her brother when she was little, like a kid. And she still took that with her in her teaching to better herself, knowing what kids are going through. But also, like, she's just someone that she checks herself and understands that not every day is perfect. Not every day is going to be a good day. And she's just someone that I swear she's like, when you meet her, because I've had the pleasure of meeting her, she's just like gives you the warmest hug, and you're like, oh my God, my day's better. Everything's fixed. Everything's fixed. But she comes with that mentality that not everything's going to be fixed in a day. And if you don't
Yeah.
know that, it's hard to think about the fact that, like, yes, teachers are here to give your kids an education. Yes, we care about your kids. Yes, we love them. We would do anything for our kids. But end of the day, if there are days where I'm not doing well, the chances of my kids learning, it's slim. I would do
Yeah.
everything I can in my power to make a good lesson, but some days I might just gonna be like, all right, you guys work in groups. I'm gonna sit at my desk for a minute because I need a minute. Yes, I'm gonna do that. And I think that's something that needs normalized. I'm not saying sit at your desk for, 15 minutes a day, every day of the week. But if you're like, you guys can do this for 5 minutes by yourself, give me five because I just need to walk away from you for a minute. And that should be normal. And some classrooms it is. Sometimes you have those kids where like, you got it. I can take 5 minutes to myself. But you also have been in classrooms, I'm sure, where you don't have 5 seconds to yourself. Because if
Yeah.
you turn around for 5 seconds, there are gummy bears on the ceiling.
And that's where I think it's just it's good for teachers to understand it's okay as high stakes as a profession this is. It's okay to be human sometimes. Like sometimes you just need to do some deep breathing and just take that 30 seconds and kind of just relax and get your bearings and then get back into it. So,
Yep,
well,
and if you can't do
I want to thank you for joining us,
yeah,
and I'd
no
like to
problem.
invite you back at some point. But thank you again, Erika Watts.
Absolutely.